Good morning. I am JP Gownder. I'm a vice president and principal analyst with Forrester. I've been with Forrester for 11 years, and I cover devices. At Forrester, we've actually been covering the wearables market since 2013, so we got kind of an early start on it. In 2014, I published a report that speaks to something that Joe was just talking about, and it was called the Enterprise Wearables Journey. We're now working on our third iteration of that report. One of the claims I made at the time was controversial even among my fellow analysts at my own company, and that was that enterprise wearables were going to be more important and a larger market than the consumer market. Horrors, everyone stood up and threw rocks because we assume that new technology today starts in the consumer market and migrates into the enterprise. But in the case of wearables in the enterprise, we find a lot of long tail kinds of purpose-built functions. And these functions often have to be ruggedized, they often have to be specialized. I'm going to show you some examples of these kinds of technologies today. Ultimately, what I think is that wearables are going to be a long tail market in general. And I'm not just going to talk about smart glasses today, by the way. I'm going to be spending some of my time on some of the other areas of the wearables market, including a strong focus on virtual reality. Now, as always, these things are cooked a few weeks in advance. So everything you see in this presentation, I put together many weeks ago before knowing who would be at this event, what would be said at this event. There are some interesting points of tangency, and there are some interesting departures. If you were here yesterday when Chris Croteau from Intel was speaking, I made a comment about how usually it's the Forrester analysts who get up on stage and say, hold on, there's too much hype from you vendors. And actually Chris was saying, you know, let's tamp down on the hype, let's be really tactical. If anything, I think my presentation today will be a little more forward-looking. So I will be talking not just about AR or smart glasses indeed, but VR as well. So let's get into this. At Forrester, we've been collecting data from IT and business decision makers in a global survey for the last several years to understand their interest in wearables. So I'm going to introduce you to that and talk a little bit about how some of your peers are thinking about this market. I'm going to then give my own definitional look at extended reality, which includes virtual, mixed, and augmented reality. We had a nice panel session yesterday in which this was discussed. I'm going to give you my own viewpoint on this. I'm going to give you a deep dive into enterprise VR. Anybody here interested in VR? I'm just curious. Show of hands. Oh, wow. So thank goodness you're interested. I recognize that a lot of the content here has been about smart glasses, which I too think is very important and will follow my VR segment. But this should be net new compared to what we talked about yesterday. And then a few thoughts and time for questions. Okay, so why do enterprises want wearables? Well, what we call this is the enterprise wearables journey. That's the theme of my talk. And as I think you saw yesterday, this isn't just sort of a go and buy it and plug it in kind of situation. This is a journey that involves business process reimagining, technology purchasing, lots of testing and piloting. A lot of organizations today, and probably even many of you here, remain at the pilot stage, but we are starting to see a lot of traction, and I think yesterday was fantastic. And I agree, Peggy gave us a really detailed viewpoint on how her organization, AGCO, is actually implementing this and moving to deployment. So let's start with that data that I promised you. One of the things that we tried to discern was how interested both IT and business decision makers. So we survey them together these days because, as we heard yesterday, you really can't do one without the other. So these are business leaders who have technology interest as well as technology leaders. And we asked them how strong of a priority it was for them to implement a strategy for and support of wearable computing devices. Now, to the surprise, again, of many of my colleagues, this number came up quite high. So in 2014, when we asked about 2015, 52% of respondents told us that this was a priority. It was on their roadmap. And that number jumped ahead further. Now let's disaggregate that data, because clearly wearables haven't gotten to the stage where they are the preeminent concern. But for 13% of organizations, you can see over here, oops, my apologies, critical priority 13% of organizations. By my experience, and I do hundreds of conversations, both for research and for inquiry with organizations in the enterprise space, many of the early adopters here were in the oil and gas industry. And this was before the price of oil declined, may have put the brakes on some of those efforts. Clearly, every major oil and gas company in the world has talked to me about the use of wearables for things that we heard about yesterday. It could be worker safety, it could be worker productivity, it could be really shaving seconds, minutes, hours off of business processes on something like an oil platform. But what you see is there is a bell curve here, there's a distribution. It is a priority, however, for many organizations. Now, the market is bigger than smart glasses. There are all sorts of different things. I realize this is a bit of an eye chart in this room. Everything from authentication. So if you've heard of, let's say, the NIMI band from the Canadian startup that allows you to authenticate using biometrics and walk around, essentially permanently authenticated, get into your office, for example. To head-mounted cameras. VidSee by Luxi is a non-smart glass version of this that does a lot of that. We have VR, we have AR, we have collaboration technologies. But we also have some very physical things. We talked just a little bit about health monitoring yesterday. In real time, can I discern if my workforce is healthy? In other words, are there biometric signs showing signs of danger? And I'll give you an example of that. Motorola Solutions did some really interesting things as well. And I think that when you look at their first responder practice, you see things like gun lock sensors. So imagine if you're in a police force, if any gun in the entire police force is unholstered, there would be an alert that would go out to everyone else in the police force. This is obviously good for worker safety, meaning the safety of the police. They also have chemical sensors, things like, was there a chemical spill or a weapon of mass destruction or something like that. So as I said at the top, wearables are a very long tail phenomenon, and each of these markets will grow at different paces. Now, there are two primary ways that enterprise wearables operate in the real world. Yesterday, we heard a lot of focus on the B2E, the business to employee. This is where your organization purchases, manages, deploys technology for your workers to make them more productive. Another aspect of this market is the B2B2C market, however. This would be where your company purchases, owns, manages these devices for the explicit use by or with customers, who could be consumers as well. So we're going to have a little bit of a discussion of each of these kinds of employment models, because yesterday we focused a lot on B2E. Here's an interesting example of a non-head-mounted display wearable. If you've heard of Theatro, it is something like a Star Trek comm badge, I guess you could say. It is a communication device designed for retail sales associates. So at the store Cabela's, which sells all sorts of outfitting and clothing and things like that, the sales associates are now hearing little whispers in their ear from this wearable device. So imagine if I'm a customer of Cabela's and I have the Cabela's app on my phone acts as a beacon. I walk into the store and they know, oh, it's JP Gownder who's here. Now, I may not know that actual retail sales associate. In order not to be completely creepy, though, they don't come up to me and say, hey, JP, how are you? Making me question whether I've met them before. But what they do know is a lot about my history. They will learn, what have I been browsing for on the Cabela's website? Or what did I purchase last time I was here? And in that way, the sales associate can guide me to try to show me things that I might be interested in. It just seems like serendipity that they know what I'm interested in, but actually they're literally hearing about it in their ear. This is a real deployment, and I believe it will continue to roll out over the course of the year. So that's a B2E, maybe a little bit of B2B2C, but the consumer doesn't know about it. We also have the area of safety. A year and a half ago, I spoke with a company in Australia called Tees. They are a mining, energy, and construction consultancy. And what they do is they send their workers into the Australian outback. If you see that snake, that is the inland taipan. It is the most venomous snake in the world. And believe me, they've had trouble with this snake. They've had some near fatality events with their workforce. Combine that with 130-degree temperatures, and you're finding that there are many reasons to track the biometrics of their workers. So essentially, they've been on a journey to find the right technology that would allow them to track in real time what the status of the health of their workers is, and then be able to send out a team with, let's say, anti-venom treatment to save the life of that worker. Of course, B2B2C was strongly innovated by Disney, as everyone is familiar, but others are doing this as well. You can see Royal Caribbean's Quantum of the Seas. We were talking yesterday about the Internet of Things. This is a $1.5 billion cruise ship that was built from the ground up to utilize Internet of Things technology. Apparently, one of the main problems people have when they take a cruise is that they get stressed out that their luggage didn't make it on board. So Royal Caribbean will RFID tag every piece of luggage at the embarkation process, and then they give you an application that allows you to track the status of your luggage, exactly where it is within the chain of moving that luggage, so that you are at peace. And you know when it gets to your stateroom as well. But they don't stop there. They use wearables to make the entire Quantum of the Seas a wallet-free experience. If I want to go jump in the pool, or if I want to go diving, or if I want to go to the gym, or if I want to go to the restaurant, it opens my door. Actually, we have keyless entry here at the W as well, although it is not fully implemented for everyone. Basically, Royal Caribbean is using wearables in this B2B2C context to reshape their customer experience. And this is happening in the UK as well at Southampton Football Club, which is one of their soccer teams. They are using the Barclaycard BPay band as a mechanism for getting in and buying goods and things like that. In the healthcare arena, and I know we have some healthcare attendees here, John Hancock has been the most forward-looking in this area in terms of using wearable technology to reshape the way that they price their services. So in order to get a discount on your term life insurance, you can voluntarily put on a Fitbit that John Hancock will give you, but in return you must share the data to prove every month that you've been active. So you can earn up to 15% every month off of your insurance rate. In this way, they're able to combine kind of big data as well as risk management as well as biometrics to change their business model. And you're going to see this more and more because the costs of healthcare are high enough that organizations are looking into this. Okay, so those are some examples outside of the head-mounted display space. But I would say, having looked at this market over the past few years, the real heat and interest and where I get my most questions and inquiries from my clients is really about extended reality. So let me give you my definition and Forrester's definition of what this market looks like. I do think that this is the most tangible short-term area, as we saw from the great examples yesterday, to drive business value for your organization. And this revolution is continuing to change. For example, in the past few weeks, we've seen Microsoft have a very big announcement about Windows Holographic, which is the technology that underlies the HoloLens device, going to move out to other OEMs like Dell and HP and others who may sign on to this to create experiences along a continuum, anywhere from virtual reality to augmented reality. And by doing that, Microsoft has helped to further problematize the line between virtual reality, mixed reality, and augmented reality. These are kissing cousin technologies. They're very, very close to one another. So I think it's important to think about this. Now, you might recall we had a boom of virtual reality in the very early 90s, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. The good thing about doing that, and even though that failed, was that academics have been looking at this for the past 25 years. And one of the concepts that they employ is the virtuality continuum. You start with the real world. I can see you through these glasses are not smart glasses, but imagine they were. I can see everything in the real world. On the other hand, I might start out in a purely digital world, like what I see in many Oculus Rift simulations, where I see a world composed of pixels. Now, those pixels could be completely fictitious, like a video game, or they could be recorded content, which used to be in the real world, but is now pixelized and sort of simulated. Along this line, you have a set of experiences that you can create with digital technologies. One of them is to augment what I see. So again, I could superimpose information either off to the side or directly over my field of view that is pertinent to the task at hand. Maybe I'd have speaker notes. Maybe it would say, JP, you're talking too quickly, or you're not speaking loudly enough. Whatever the context you're in, that's where augmented reality happens. Of course, you can also augment the virtual world. Now, we remember Second Life was a 2D kind of virtual world. You can also augment that, and that's what Oculus Rift and HTC Vive and others are doing. They're bringing a sense of physicality and presence to a virtual world that makes you feel as though you are immersed there. In other words, it's that sense of presence, which is done by 3D imagery, 360-degree viewpoints, by 3D sound and other things. Of course, there's also this special case of augmented reality, which is mixed reality. This tends to be more on the holographic side. And what it's doing is, as was mentioned yesterday, it's very aware of the real world, and it can interact those holograms with the real world. So if you've ever used HoloLens, you can actually drop a hologram right on top of that table. It will understand that there's a table. If you use HoloLens in a context of gaming, I played a game where you could have this little avatar, you made him go around the room. When he jumped on the couch, he jumped higher because it was able to understand that that couch was a bouncy surface. So there are many different dimensions to mixed reality that blur the lines here, particularly with a device like HoloLens. You see many of these different vendors, of course, everything from monocular versions, which are very scalable. I think it's very important. I think Chris Croteau made this clear yesterday, that if you are looking for a workforce sort of enablement project today where you want to order 500 or 1,000 of these devices, you are probably looking mostly at the monocular versions, with some exceptions, and go talk to our friends, the vendors out here, about what they're able to ship. The more immersive you get, the more likely it is that you're looking at smaller orders where perhaps fulfillment isn't there yet or the maturity isn't completely there yet. But that's okay. I mean, this is a growing market. You know, if I gave this talk 3 months ago, the state of the art would be different than it is today. We also have VR headsets, and we see discrimination here as well. You have the spatial version at the very high end. HTC Vive allows you to delimit a 15 by 15 space, or whatever size your room is, and to use hand controllers to navigate through that room. If you haven't used the HTC Vive, it is an incredible device that has many enterprise potential scenarios, which I'll go through. The Oculus Rift, of course, some of these OS VR rigs, and then phone-based VR, which is going to be a big part of this market going forward, where we're going to see much more mass adoption, both in enterprise as well as in consumer. Okay, so let's start with VR here, because I think that it's very easy to see it as a powerful gaming platform or even for entertainment. But what is lacking in many cases is an understanding of how you can use it in an enterprise context. First, we need to deal with some hype problems. Haven't we tried this before? Wasn't there a big boom in the 90s? Why did it fail? These are questions that I get constantly from skeptics who say VR is just a fad. In 1991, of course, Howard Rheingold wrote a very famous book that was probably about 25 years ahead of time. You always want to be ahead of things as an analyst, but maybe you don't want to be 25 years ahead. So he was on television constantly. You can go find YouTube videos. He was on 60 Minutes, and, well, things didn't really go the way that we had hoped. People sort of had this assumption that VR was going to be like the holodeck, that you're going to be able to actually, you know, interact with people in this extremely real-world environment. This was not helpful. Movies hyped the potential here. Lots of different movies. Demolition Man, you know, there was the famous scene where Sandra Bullock says to Sylvester Stallone, "Do you want to have sex?" And he's very excited, and she means virtual sex. She's not touching him. So this was very, very hyped up. And what happened was that the early VR rigs turned out to be very expensive. So this virtuality rig that you see here was about $70,000. Which is about $100,000 in today's money. And they had a lot of problems with performance. The latency was not there. Vertigo was very common, so VR sickness, or also known as nausea, was a common problem. And of course, the graphics and such were not very good. Okay, so people say it's been tried before, it's 3D TV all over again, there's no money to be made. These problems have been solved. Fundamentally, the technology has low latency, it's incredibly powerful. This is developing a huge ecosystem. I spend a lot of time talking to VR developers who are working very hard to create scenarios across the spectrum, and we'll see some of those in just a moment. And in fact, business models are very deeply tied to the technology in a way that they were not in an era when you had to go to a video arcade to use virtual reality. The economics have shifted radically by my calculations looking at the computing power of yesterday's VR versus today's. We have about 1.3 million times the power at 1/50th the cost. Anytime you see economics like that for a technology, you know that you're moving to a realm of mass adoption, assuming that that technology has some fundamental value to it, which VR does. I've also forecasted this market in the United States These are an estimate of demand, a forecast for VR headset units in millions, which I see selling 52 million distinct units by 2020. Now, in the background, there are 4 different forecasts, which I cannot share with you unless you're a client. But they are 2 consumer forecasts, one for high-end, one for phone-based, and 2 enterprise forecasts, one for high-end, one for phone-based. And believe me, the enterprise portion of this is significant, and we'll see why in just a sec. Six Flags, very good example here. This is an organization that owns, of course, roller coasters. Roller coasters have a fundamental problem. It's hard to get people to ride them more than twice. It's just a fact. Over the years, theme park owners have tried this. The interest wears off. Now imagine, though, if you synchronize the movement of your roller coaster to a digital experience in VR that is deeply integrated into every single twist and turn. Well, it can be a pretty stunning experience. But what it also gives Six Flags is a business model innovation that is totally new. The first time, I could be riding the back of a dragon. The second time, I could be on a spaceship. The third time, I could be in a submarine. So the business model itself is changing by creating essentially new products based off of existing infrastructure. This project, by the way, using Samsung Galaxy Gear, is going to cost them about $1 million, but when they do the calculation, they see huge gains in the future. So that's a B2B2C, where you're buying the technology and deploying it with your customers. VR also offers more intuitive shopping. This is a company called Retail, R-E-T-A-L-E. They are doing some interesting work around this for JCPenney and others. The idea here is that when we shop in e-commerce, we're using a highly abstracted approach in order to shop, right? We're typing things in, we're going to menus. It's not how we shop in the real world. In the real world, we have serendipity. We can walk by something and see it and say, what is that? I want that. That's what they're trying to replicate here in VR. Lowe's is one of the most forward-thinking companies in terms of how they use virtual technology, extended reality in general. One of the things they've done is to help people to design their kitchens and bathrooms using VR. And by the way, now they're also going to be using HoloLens for this purpose. Imagine if you can design the entirety of your kitchen, understand the relationship between every appliance and every cabinet. You can also then take that home. They have a vending machine. You know what those are? Those are Google Cardboard devices. So you can actually design your kitchen, take home a free VR viewer, and be able to show it to your family and determine if it's right for you. Now, what is the goal here? It is to increase the conversion rate of purchases. In other words, once you go down this path with Lowe's, you've invested a lot and you have tangible, seemingly tangible virtual assets that allow you to understand what you're buying. Audi is spending a lot of money on VR. They are going to create one of the most comprehensive VR platforms here to replicate their entire showroom experience. Now, in early instances, they will be using this only in person, right? Because again, people don't yet have these headsets at home. But what they will do is imagine, we know, for example, that retail, the footprint of retailers is declining rapidly, right? There's no interest in these giant stores anymore. They can't keep up with the SKUs in light of e-commerce. So imagine if you had a Tesla-sized store and you're Audi. You could have an endless aisle experience where you can show every single SKU of Audi in hyper-realistic Oculus Rift detail, but you only have a very, very tiny commercial footprint. That's one way that they will be using this. There's some really cool examples too. This is the Dali Museum. They created a VR experience where you could actually go inside of the painting and sort of explore it and learn about it. Learning and development is very important here. In the military and in some clinical psychology settings, they're also using VR as a therapeutic mechanism. So imagine if you have PTSD and you're a soldier who served in Iraq. They can replicate that experience in VR and have a trained therapist inure you to that experience and help you overcome your PTSD. So there's some very interesting things going on there. Now, on a pure enterprise business-to-employee basis, there are some really interesting things too. This is a company in the Middle East called ASM Technologies that works with a lot of the oil exploration companies in the United Arab Emirates and other places. What they've done is they've replicated their physical real-world assets into VR, and then they've used sensors on those assets in the real world to understand the status. So you put on the VR headset, you can visualize exactly what's going on in your business, on your oil platform, in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, And this is much more effective than, let's say, a camera, which is not actually telling you things like temperature or maintenance schedules or other kinds of things. But with the Internet of Things, you can. So visualizing complex asset situations is a very powerful use case. Now, in other cases, people are using VR to visualize data. There's a company called Genesis, a very major contact center vendor in the world. They have tens of thousands of contact center employees. Imagine if you're a manager there, you don't want to go through every Excel spreadsheet to figure out what's going on. In VR, you could say, I want to see my Indian call centers here, my Canadian ones over here. A BI dashboard will pop up for each. You could also then move over here, because you're in 360, and say, I don't want to look geographically, I want high performers here, low performers here. 2 different dashboards will come up. In this way, you can actually, as a manager, understand the status of your business and make better decisions and make people more efficient and effective. You have a lot of drone stuff going on as well, which I won't go into. Entire social worlds are also springing up here. Imagine everyone in your company wants to have an offsite, but you don't want to fly everyone to a location. AltSpace VR can host a space for you with avatars that would allow everyone in your company to get together, and we could break off. I could go talk to Joe, I could go talk to Chris Croteau, I could go talk to whoever, and we would all be in the same virtual space. You can't do that on a teleconference. You can't do that on a video conference. It's very interesting technology. Okay, so here's, now that's my VR viewpoint, and we'll take a few questions at the end if there's time. I want to give you my smart glass viewpoint. And as I said at the top, I'm going to be showing you probably things that are maybe a little bit further ahead from the stuff that we talked about yesterday. Some of these may not be at scale yet, but they are very promising over the next few years. And frankly, what will create scale is if people like you in this audience implement some of these things. So I believe smart glasses are going to reshape the way workers work in many, many different jobs, and I'm going to explain some of those in a moment. Yesterday, you heard Gary talk about my forecast. This is, I think, kind of unique in the industry that we've published this forecast of demand. 14.4 million smart glass users in the US workforce by 2025. That's 8% of the US workforce. On some level, that might be seen as a little bit conservative because there are a lot of things that can happen between now and 2025. For example, Magic Leap is out there somewhere, lurking. We don't know what they're doing down in Dania Beach, Florida. They are $1.4 billion funded. By 2025, we could actually have a consumer smart glass market that would then feed into, let's say, general workforce scenarios. In other words, all of us may be carrying smart glasses at some point. I'm not ready to say that yet. I don't know what Magic Leap is going to be coming out with. But a lot can happen in that period of time. But how you should think about this is not so much about the pure numbers, but about the opportunity. Because this was a ground-up exercise where we looked at what are the different jobs in the US economy, what kind of skill sets do they employ, are those skill sets amenable to the use of smart glasses, and you can see the names of the titles that come up here: operators, technicians, machines, repairers, even medical comes up here. These are the common kinds of jobs based on an analysis of 264 different job categories that I worked on. So these are the types of people that will use them. If you were looking at the vast market, who are the top people by relevance? It's going to be your aircraft mechanics and service technicians, your electromechanical technicians. You can read the list here. You're also going to see by market size, in other words, the number of people, maintenance and repair, electricians, and even nurses make the list here. So this is based, again, on an understanding of the job fundamentals of each of these job categories, which is in this vast database called the ONET database that the US government has put out. It seems to me a reasonable way, for those of you who are Forrester clients, you can read the report as well that goes into detail. There are some really interesting things going on in this place today. Now, of course, I didn't know a couple weeks ago that both Boeing and Apex Labs would be here. There's Brian. So here you can talk to them more about some of the work that they're doing together. The interview that I had with them around this involved something called a wire, what is it called? A wire hanger? A wire frame? A harness, thank you. I'm not an aerospace guy. So this wire harness process was very, very challenging for Boeing And using Apex Labs Skylight software, they've changed the entire way that they create that. I would recommend you go find those guys and chat with them if you want to find out more. Aether Labs is here as well. Again, I don't know who's going to be here. Have talked to them before and have looked at some of the case studies that they have. What I like about the way that they've presented their offering here is this is essentially a visual guide to the Internet of Things, right? That engine is self-aware. It understands how many hours it's been in service. It understands when its last service record happened. It understands what panel you should be accessing. All of that M2M information needs a translation point. And smart glasses, particularly those with the more augmented reality, are able to give you that viewpoint. We also see a lot going on with HoloLens. For those who are really interested in HoloLens, I have spent a lot of time using this device and talking to folks who've used this device. Trimble is an architectural software firm that has created, those maquettes, those models that they make. Those little models that are made of cardboard are $100,000 each. I never knew that. Using HoloLens, you can get rid of that cost and you can basically make changes in real time. It's a very, very effective scenario. You may have seen some of the medical research and customized patient analysis examples. Imagine that you go to the hospital, you have your organs, MRI'd, whatever, they're visualized in 3 dimensions, and your physician can actually rotate that organ, like your heart, to determine a course of treatment. Now, we're not quite here yet, but at Case Western Reserve University, they're already using HoloLens in their classroom settings to teach the next generation of doctors about anatomy. I've spent some time with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory folks. One of the geologists at NASA told me he learned more in a week with HoloLens than he learned in 6 months looking at 2D imagery. Why? Because geologists need to look at things like, where was water flowing? How is this rock situated versus another? 3D is completely important to them. And of course, collaboration. We saw some of this yesterday. You don't have to use HoloLens for this. But having a first-person viewpoint and being able to project that to a call center, to an expert, to help you through a problem, this is a huge area of value. There's some live implementations of interesting things as well. This is the Brescia Museum in Italy. It's not noted here, but that's the Epson Moverio device. Those horrible audio tours where they say press 1, press 2, not at Brescia. Brescia is an outdoor archaeological site, and so they're able to bring up pertinent information about structures and statues and things like that. On my list for a visit. Of course, we've also seen AR applications on tablets that are now moving into the smart glass space. This is Mitsubishi Heating and Cooling. Years ago, they had a problem. They were selling those split duct kind of, or ductless air conditioners. So you can see in your house, you have that big unit. Number one question was, how big is the unit going to be in my house? The salesperson would walk in and they say, oh, it's about this big. Not very effective. People were not convinced, oddly enough. So they developed an AR app so that you could see exactly what it would look like in context in your own room with your own, and share it with your family or whatever. By the way, this application was developed by a company called Mateo, which was subsequently bought by Apple. I love this example because it reminds me of when I go to the hospital and get blood drawn. Phlebotomists sometimes miss your vein. And Epson, working with Avena Medical, have figured out a way to help the phlebotomist see the veins in your arms, superimpose it over your field of vision, and then the phlebotomist can take your blood. And guess what? Fewer punctures means fewer infections. Phlebotomists are busy people, so they have productivity goals as well. More customers can go through more quickly. And then my favorite part is it doesn't hurt as much. Okay, so I know I'm near the end of my time. Just a few thoughts for you that I think are consistent with some things that you heard yesterday. Happy to take a couple questions if we have time. The first thing is, many of you in this room are going to have to be the ambassadors. You've come to this event, you've learned some fascinating and very, very detailed things about how others are using enterprise wearables. I want you to also educate yourselves about the potential of today's offerings versus tomorrow's. Sometimes, some of the things I've just shown you may not scale, right? Google Glass, Vuzix, we know that they have huge, massive scale. You need to ask vendors that you're thinking of working with what kind of scale they're able to achieve today, and have they proven it? You have to work closely with business leaders. I was so happy to hear this so many times yesterday from various experts who came up. You've got to work on the business case from get-go. This is a business technology investment, and so you want to have KPIs in place from the very beginning to prove that this investment is useful. And then piloting. I think we heard a lot about this yesterday, but it is so critical to work on this in an iterative fashion where you capture the learnings and improve over time. It is a wearables journey for a reason. It's not off the shelf, it's not always simple, but I do think it is worthwhile. And that's what I have for you today. Thank you. Do we have time for a question? We have time for a question? Okay. I think there's microphones. Let's try to use the mics because it's helpful for everyone. I see someone running with a mic. So as soon as the mic gets over there, we'll take our first question. Thank you. Name and company, please.
Hi, Shamik Basu from Verizon.
Hi.
Now, we heard a theme yesterday about the millennial workforce entering the industry. We heard a theme today and yesterday about hygiene and aesthetics tied to the use of wearables. How important is it, as we look at an enterprise-first kind of approach, that we collaborate with the consumer-first approaches just to make sure that these things actually take off?
I think it's an interesting question, and I'm curious, what's behind your question this idea that millennial workers will reject non-consumer technology? Is that something sort of inherent to your question?
Yeah, more so something that has appeal for them, as opposed to something that's being handed to them.
Yeah.
That might not be.
So I did a research report on millennial workers because there was a lot of questions about this, about how it affects your ability to deploy technology. I think it can be overstated, this idea that millennials are completely different. I think part of it is also a maturation as they move through the workforce, that they are going to catch up to trends. Not all of them, right? They're digital natives, there will always be differences, but I do think that in some cases this has been a little bit overblown. I think if we learned one thing yesterday, and what I've learned over time, is that putting these systems in place is tremendously challenging. And getting the business case in order is a higher order sort of priority than some of these social angles. You can teach people about how to do their job, and they may not always immediately embrace it. I'm sure the first UPS person who had to deliver using a tablet had problems with it. So I think there's a line there, and the best solution in my mind is through piloting and talking to the workers. In other words, if you find through your pilot process that millennials are a strong rejection point for this technology, learn more about that and see if there are ways you can choose a different vendor or technology that would make them more comfortable. But I wouldn't call millennials a huge barrier in and of themselves. They can be part of the process. Next.
Hi, Matt Johnson, Design Interactive. Our company got our start back in the 90s on sim sickness research. And when VR started to boom initially, the phone was ringing a lot. It started to ring a lot again, as you could possibly imagine. And we've done a lot of work, although unpublished at this point, to show that it's still an issue. It's not as much an issue, granted, but it is still an issue, being able to show that after even 30 minutes of exposure, people walk around your office as though they're inebriated.
Yes.
Guidelines don't exist for how to integrate that into a workflow in order to provide a frictionless workflow. We're trying to work on that. But in terms of the use cases you've seen, where there's been success or maybe less success, do you have any examples where people have come across that challenge, how they might have overcome it, or what technologies out there that you see might have been doing a better job at avoiding this issue than others? Yeah,
so this is totally true. What you've said is correct. Simulation sickness used to be very commonplace in VR, now it's only somewhat commonplace. Oculus, for example, on their developer site has a whole list of best practices about how to design applications that will not trigger VR sickness. The reason for this is that we've overcome the hardware challenge, the under 20-second latency that is generally thought to be the point at which VR sickness kicks in. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't stop an application developer from developing something that flips you upside down or something and that really triggers it anyway. I was telling Joe earlier, I can't play Eve Valkyrie on my Oculus Rift. Like, it's the only game that makes me VR ill. So most of the organizations that I've talked to are working hand in hand with VR experts, external experts who have a viewpoint on this. Once again, a lot of times these application developers will show them something similar, do some tests before they even start developing, try to show a templated version of an application that they can then show to workers and determine those things. As you mentioned, there's a limit to how many hours a day you're going to want to wear a VR headset. We see VR as more of a episodic, occasional thing that you're going to dip into for a period of time to get very deep into visualizing a new product or visualizing data or something like that. Whereas the smart glasses side, monocular, binocular, immersive, non-immersive, that is more, the aim there is for the worker to wear that for 8 hours at a time, to have good battery life, to complete multiple workflows. So indeed, most of my clients who I've talked to have this problem. They've overcome it through iteration as well. Do we have time for one more? One more? I saw so many hands, so it's up to the guy with the mic. He will determine the next. One more.
Hi, Zach Penix with AES. So I appreciate your recommendations to track KPIs. It makes me think that it's useful. And so I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you the useful question. Just how useful are these wearables to companies that have rolled them out? Specifically, are there people who are realizing multi-million-dollar impacts other than companies like Disney that can claim marketing numbers?
Yes, although those names can't be told because I know under NDA about that. What I will say is my next report is an ROI study of smart glasses in the enterprise. What we've done, though, is we've taken 3 different scenarios. There's no generalized ROI here, as those of you who've done this know. It has to be looked at in context of specific workflows. For example, I have been working with a company that is a global insurance company. They have thousands of insurance adjusters who they send out to see this home burn down, this car crashed, this factory had some event. They're using smart glasses to capture that data, and they've been able to accrue a 30% improvement in productivity. They don't want to be named because they are part of an industry where this is a competitive differentiator. So we will look at things like insurance. We will look at, of course, field service. We will also look at actually the museum example because we have a lot of government and museum clients who are interested in those kinds of things. So I would say that the various, when you're going to get to it, there's no common number, but maybe if I had to be, at gunpoint, I would say somewhere between 10 and 30% in many of the instances from our interviews. So, thank you, everyone.